The man known to history as Otto von Bismarck was born on the 1st of April 1815 in the Saxon town of Schonhausen in northeastern Germany. His family were Junkers, which were a class of the Prussian nobility who owned estates and land and who were expected to serve as officers in the Prussian military. Otto's father Karl was one such Junker and had served as an officer in the Prussian armed forces, whilst his mother, Wilhelmine, was the daughter of a government bureaucrat in Berlin. Young Bismarck soon proved himself to be an intelligent young man and became fluent in English, French, Italian, Polish and German, and was also encouraged from an early age to have an interest in the military. Bismarck was then further educated under Johann Ernst Planmann, who was a noted teacher of young children, and then Otto went on to attend 2 secondary schools and 3 universities including Göttingen, Berlin and Greifswald, studying law and agriculture. He had wanted initially to become a diplomat, but gave up his training in law and then served in the Landwehr or reserves as an officer before returning to his family house at Schonhausen after his mother died in 1839. Around this time, Bismarck became a Lutheran, which was a branch of Protestantism which had originated within Germany under Martin Luther in the 1500s. On the 28th of July 1847, Otto married a noblewoman, Johanna von Puttkamer, who was by all accounts a shy and pious lady, and the couple went on to have a happy marriage, parenting 3 children together, Marie, Herbert and Wilhelm, between 1847 and 1852. In 1847, Bismarck was appointed to become a representative in the newly formed Prussian legislature and soon gained a reputation for being a pro-monarchist, often arguing for the Prussian monarchy's divine right to rule, which was a stance he would maintain for the whole of his life. The monarchy was a topic of hot debate within Prussia at the time, as a wave of unrest was spreading across Europe, culminating the revolutions of 1848, which saw the middle and working classes across the continent rise up in effect to gain more rights. These revolutions spread to nearly 50 countries throughout the continent, with the middle classes arguing for greater democratic governance, and the working classes arguing for better pay and working conditions. In Prussia itself, in March 1848, large crowds gathered in central Berlin and demanded that the King, Frederick Wilhelm IV, grant them free elections, a constitution and freedom of the press, which the King subsequently agreed to. Then, on the 13th of March, a confrontation erupted between the police, the military and protesters in Tiergarten, which was a park in central Berlin. This resulted in hundreds being killed, and the King on the 21st of March led the funeral procession through the streets of Berlin to commemorate the tragedy. King Frederick Wilhelm even wore the revolutionary tricolour of red, black and gold, which is the origin of the modern German flag. Bismarck, as a monarchist, tried to aid the government against the protesters by travelling to Berlin, but was told instead to gather food supplies for the army on his estates. The revolution eventually petered out, however, as divisions arose between the middle and working classes, meaning that they were no longer powerful enough to force their will on the government, and conservative pro-monarchists soon regained full control of Berlin by the end of the year. In 1849, Bismarck was elected to the Landtag, which was the lower house of the Prussian legislature, and argued against the growing calls for unification of the various German states, as he feared that Prussia would lose its independence. There had been calls for a unification between the various German states, such as Prussia, Saxony and Hanover, to name but a few, during the Revolution, but as the general population, particularly the middle classes, wanted any unified German nation to have democratic governance, there was naturally strong resistance from the conservative monarchists throughout the German states, who feared that they would lose power and influence in any such system. Bismarck, as one such monarchist, was then appointed in 1849 to the Erfurt Parliament, which was a body composed of delegates from the various German states, in order to discuss the plans for German unification. Otto joined and went to the Parliament as one of Prussia's representatives, largely so he could disrupt and stop negotiations. But plans for unification soon failed, largely down to Prussia and Austria failing to support the Union, as both wanted supremacy over the various German states. Prussia had been vying with Austria for domination of the various German-speaking peoples since the reign of Frederick the Great, and both were now seeking to regain control over the reformed German Confederation, which had been abandoned after the Revolution of 1848. The German Confederation, in essence, was an assembly through which the German states could meet and discuss and solve problems within the German-speaking lands and agree foreign policies. In 1851, Bismarck was appointed by King Frederick Wilhelm IV as Prussia's envoy to the German Confederation in Frankfurt, where he spent 8 years and was also elected to the Prussian House of Lords. Whilst in Frankfurt, Bismarck often quarrelled with Austrian delegates over petty matters such as smoking during meetings, which on one occasion ended in a duel. During his time in Frankfurt, Bismarck began to form more coherent views on how Prussia could gain more influence and power within Germany by allying itself with the smaller German states against the Austrians. This made him change his views regarding the unification of Germany, and he began to argue with his fellow conservatives that Prussia should take a leading role in any unification, which could have long-term beneficial consequences for Prussia, as well as weakening the influence of its rival, Austria. Indeed, Bismarck changing his mind regarding the unification of Germany in many ways was the most important decision of his life, as the remainder of his political career would largely involve him bringing about the unification of Germany and the preservation of it. Good relations were also fostered between Prussia and its neighbouring powers to the west and east, namely France and Russia, which would prove to be ultimately fruitless, as the two countries would come to oppose German unification. Over the coming years, Bismarck was sent to both Russia and France as ambassador by Prussia's new regent Wilhelm, who would later become Wilhelm I, after his brother, Frederick Wilhelm IV, had suffered a debilitating stroke in 1859 and died 2 years later. The new king faced growing problems, however, as he wanted to reorganise and increase Prussia's army, but faced resistance from liberals within the country's legislature. Wilhelm I then threatened to vacate the throne if his new military budget was not approved, meaning that Bismarck was recalled to the country, as he was seen as one of the few politicians capable of solving the crisis. Wilhelm then appointed Bismarck as Minister-President and Foreign Minister in September 1862, effectively making him head of government under the king. As a monarchist, Bismarck fought the king's corner against those in Prussia resisting military expansion, despite liberals holding nearly 2/3 of the seats in the legislature. But as Bismarck himself was a product of the aristocracy, he obviously was far more interested in the maintenance of power for his class than allowing the lower classes greater suffrage, at least for the time being. The earlier revolutions of 1848 had sparked an idea of a common German brotherhood amongst the smaller states, which comprised the German Confederation, and Bismarck would come to use this growing nationalistic feeling to promote both his and Prussia's own interests and eventually unify the German states under Prussian control. In November 1863, the King of Denmark, Frederick VII, died, making his son, Christian IX, king of the country. Christian then laid claim to the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, which were both semi-independent areas of northern Germany and southern Denmark, which were divided between German and Danish-speaking peoples, although the Danish monarchy still had overlordship over them, even though Holstein was still a member of the German Confederation. The resulting tension over time led to Prussia and Denmark going to war over the duchies, in which Denmark was victorious, and subsequently meant that both Holstein and Schleswig remained under Danish control, but they were still duchies in their own right, meaning that they were more of a protectorate than being a part of Denmark itself. Christian IX, on becoming king, then claimed Holstein and Schleswig for Denmark and sought to integrate Holstein under the Danish flag by enacting the November Constitution, which was the process by which Denmark would assimilate the territories. The German Confederation, largely led by Prussia, then acted to preserve the status of the two duchies, and Confederation forces, including Prussian and Austrian troops, occupied Schleswig in February 1864, and after the Danes were defeated by Prussian troops in the Battle of Dieboll in April of the same year, Denmark was forced to surrender the territories to the German Confederation, which were then placed under the effective control of both Prussia and Austria as the dominant powers of the Confederation, with Prussia controlling Schleswig and Austria Holstein. Bismarck knew, however, that for Prussia to dominate the German-speaking states in Europe, there was one remaining problem: Austria. It was the only German power capable of challenging Prussia and holding her in check, and thusly he resolved to remove Austria from the German equation. Austria then went back on its agreement between itself and Prussia over Schleswig-Holstein, after disputes continued between it and Prussia over the administration of the two duchies. Austria then asked the Federal Convention of the German Confederation to meet and resolve the question of Schleswig-Holstein, which in Prussia's eyes broke their agreement with Austria, which thusly gave Bismarck the excuse for war he had wanted, and he subsequently ordered Prussian troops to cross the border into Austrian-controlled Holstein on the 14th of June 1866. The resulting conflict effectively split the German Confederation down the middle, with many of the smaller German states joining either Prussia or Austria in the war. Bismarck also agreed an alliance with Italy against Austria, which forced them to divide their forces to defend their southern border, which was one of the major factors in the war's outcome. After a series of small engagements, the Prussian and Austrian armies then met in Bohemia in the Battle of Königgrätz on the 3rd of July 1866, which consisted of nearly 500,000 troops between the two sides. After the Austrians initially fared well on the battlefield, the Prussians rallied and forced them to retreat, resulting in a victory for Bismarck's forces. The defeat at Königgrätz was a great blow for the Austrians, and peace talks then began after little under 2 months since the war's starting. Bismarck had wanted to conclude a peace treaty with Austria quickly, as prolonging the war would risk other great powers such as France and Russia entering the conflict on Austria's side. He also did not want to weaken Austria completely, as he saw fairly cordial relations between Prussia and Austria as essential in a relatively hostile European theatre. In return for Prussia not pushing further into Austrian lands, the country was forced to surrender any involvement in the German Confederation, which was itself dissolved in favour of the Prussian-controlled Northern German Federation. The peace treaty between Austria and Prussia, or the Peace of Prague, as it became known, was then signed on the 23rd of August 1866, and hostilities officially came to an end. Bismarck's gamble in going to war with Austria had paid off spectacularly. Prussia was now the dominant power in German affairs, and the path was now clear for the country to gain further control over the other German-speaking states. In many ways, Bismarck's greatest coup regarding the Austrian conflict was bringing about peace so quickly, and with such favourable terms for Prussia, as Napoleon III's France was banking on the war being much longer, and itself was planning to gain concessions from Prussia for not joining the conflict on Austria's side. Tensions had been growing between France and Prussia for years, and now Bismarck's control over Germany once again made Prussia a prime target for the major powers in Europe, who saw the new rising state as a threat to their respective security. The southern German states had largely backed Austria in the war against Prussia, but Bismarck also intended for them to come under Prussian control over the course of time. He saw war with France in many ways inevitable, and also thought that if France was seen as the aggressor in any war with Prussia, that the southern German states would be forced to ally with him, largely due to their relative proximity with the French border. Bismarck once again looked for an excuse to start a conflict with the French, and found one in 1870 when a German prince, Leopold of Hohenzollern, was offered the vacant Spanish throne. Emperor Napoleon III of France, who was Napoleon Bonaparte's first nephew, realised that a German on the Spanish throne would mean that France would potentially be surrounded by two enemies on their eastern and southern borders, and argued bitterly against Leopold's ascension to the Spanish throne. Bismarck wanted a war with France, as he thought the country would not stand a chance against Prussia's superior, battle-hardened troops, and thusly agitated public opinion in both Germany and France by publishing edited correspondence of meetings between French officials and the Prussian king. The French also greatly feared any further unification of the German states under Prussia, and incorrectly thought that a war with Prussia would make unification less and not more likely. Napoleon III and the French Parliament were not nearly as clever as Bismarck's Prussia, however, and subsequently fell for the bait by declaring war on the North German Federation on the 19th of July 1870. The French declaring war on Prussia first had exactly the effect on the southern German states that Bismarck wanted, and they duly formed an alliance with the Northern German Federation against the French, effectively meaning that Germany was now a unified power in all but name. The Franco-Prussian War, as it became known, was another great success for Bismarck, although it should be noted that, as with his earlier victories over Austria and Denmark, the Prussian army was led by Bismarck's go-to man, the Prussian Chief of Staff Helmut von Moltke the Elder, who was the uncle of Helmut von Moltke the Younger, himself the German Chief of Staff during the early to middle stages of World War I. Von Moltke the Elder was a superb strategist and tactician, and also had a great understanding of logistics, and he oversaw the organisation and preparations for the war against the French, which he had been planning for some years. As with the war against Austria, von Moltke had used the growing German railway network to his advantage. This was a new feature in warfare, and had first been fully utilised by the Union armies during the American Civil War, and now Prussia was at the forefront of the European powers in terms of modernising both their armed forces and logistics, and the catalyst for this change was von Moltke. Indeed, the destinies of Bismarck and Moltke are difficult to separate, as without Moltke, it is highly doubtful Bismarck would have been able to win the wars he started, and without Bismarck, von Moltke would have never had the chance to show his brilliance as a military commander. Von Moltke's plan was for the German forces to be split into three armies, which were concentrated around the Marne region of southern central Germany. The reason for this positioning being that Bismarck and Moltke predicted that the French would not advance through Belgium or the Netherlands, as it would disrespect those countries' neutrality. This would be seen in a very negative light by the major neutral powers such as Russia and Britain. Von Moltke also correctly predicted that any French advance would come south of Luxembourg via Strasbourg and Metz, and divided his forces into armies which were always close enough to support each other in any battle. His plan was to meet and defeat the French armies one by one, and come between them and Paris to cut off their supply lines. The armies which now faced each other numbered in the millions, but each side's forces were divided up into smaller armies numbering a few 100,000 men in total, which could support one another if needed. The initial stages of the conflict resulted in the initiative being firmly claimed by the Prussians, and leaving the French essentially firefighting after consecutive defeats to Bismarck's forces across the whole front. Napoleon III had come under considerable pressure to take the offensive against Prussia, but after advancing just a few miles into Germany, the French were halted and forced onto the back foot. Battles such as Wissembourg, Spissheeren, Worth, Mars-le-Tour and Gravelotte resulted in heavy losses for both sides, but in each case the Germans were victorious, taking the field from their enemy, who were pushed back further into France itself. Already it was clear that the German forces were better organised, supplied and led than the French, and really, after the early victories in the war, the outcome of the conflict was never in any doubt. Another consequence of the continued French losses was that a large portion of its forces were besieged after the Battle of Gravelotte in the city of Metz. Napoleon III then assembled a new army and led his forces himself in an effort to relieve the besieged city and marched to aid his besieged forces. But von Moltke anticipated this and left a portion of his forces to continue the siege of Metz. He then pursued Napoleon III's armies, catching up with them on the 30th of August 1870 near Bourmont, which resulted in another French withdrawal towards Sedan. Napoleon III was again out of control of events and was now isolated and at severe risk of being caught in the middle of converging Prussian forces. His army subsequently took up defensive positions in the city of Sedan and were then largely surrounded by the pursuing German armies, which then started their attack on Sedan on the 1st of September 1870. Napoleon III had by this time delegated control of his army to his generals, who compounded the already desperate situation by giving their troops conflicting orders to firstly break out of the city to the west and then stay and fight. The result was further confusion and disorganisation in the French army, and the Emperor's forces attempted repeated counterattacks, but were each time beaten back by the Prussian forces, resulting in the Germans tightening their stranglehold over the town, until eventually Emperor Napoleon ordered his army to surrender. The French defeat at Sedan effectively ended the war, as they lost nearly 122,000 troops, either killed, wounded or captured to the Germans, and Bismarck himself received the French Emperor after the battle. But despite Napoleon's capture, the war was destined to continue after the French government was overthrown in a popular uprising, leading to the creation of the Third French Republic. Bismarck's armies then laid siege to Paris itself from the 19th of September 1870 until the 28th of January 1871, resulting in an armistice being signed as Paris was left in a state of starvation. Bismarck then sent large amounts of German army rations into the French capital after the armistice, and a final peace treaty was negotiated and signed between the two countries in May of 1871, resulting in large portions of Alsace-Lorraine being ceded to Germany, which the French would not soon forgive or forget. After the Franco-Prussian War, Bismarck moved quickly to capitalise on the newly found German patriotism his victories had secured, and began negotiations to unite the rest of Germany, which eventually succeeded, leading to the creation of the German Empire, and King Wilhelm I of Prussia was then subsequently proclaimed Emperor of Germany. Although Germany was not a nation in its truest form, still being a federation of all the German states, Prussian leadership was secured, and there was now no going back. Germany, as we know it today, had been born. The remainder of Bismarck's political life was one of consolidation of Germany's gains, avoiding any unnecessary wars, and reacting to social changes in Germany, which its increased industrialisation had brought about during the late 1800s. He started an anti-Catholic campaign in the country, having papal officials and bishops exiled, and also oversaw the creation of one of the world's first successful welfare states. This was intended to ease unrest amongst the working classes and thusly make them more loyal to the ruling elite. These included sickness insurance, accident insurance, and old age and disability insurance, long before the concept of state welfare had even been dreamt of in more liberal countries such as Britain. Indeed, when one looks at Bismarck's life in its entirety, the overwhelming impression one gets is of a man who above all cared and loved for the Prussian monarchy, but also the idea of Germany itself. He was incredibly pragmatic in how he achieved his goals, and the fact that a right-wing conservative was prepared to countenance state welfare proves this. In short, Bismarck was prepared to consider any option, either liberal or conservative in its political outlook, if it brought about the preservation and success of both the Prussian state and the German state. Indeed, although Germany did seek to gain colonial possessions in the late 1800s, as with German New Guinea for example, Bismarck tried, as previously mentioned, to keep Germany out of any future European wars in order to preserve everything he had fought for over his career. However, although Bismarck was indeed Chancellor of the German Empire, he was still a loyal servant of the Emperor or Kaiser, and would have to do as he was told if the monarch wanted things to be done a certain way. This was the greatest weakness of Bismarck and Germany itself, as supreme power ultimately laid in the hands of the Emperor, meaning that despite Germany being the most modern state in Europe, its government was still in many ways a medieval-style hereditary monarchy, which of course Bismarck himself had no problem with. This meant that the fate of Germany was ultimately decided by one person, and that person's mistakes would have massive ramifications for the country and for the continent as a whole. But things were fine as long as the German Emperor had the intelligence to listen to his Chancellor. But in 1888, Wilhelm II ascended to the German throne. Being possessed of average intelligence at best, and having a highly unstable nature, but being very certain and confident in his views, Wilhelm had been brought up to believe that he had been appointed by God himself to lead Germany. This, along with his shriveled arm and his awe and jealousy of the power of the British Empire, made Wilhelm an extremely impulsive and unpredictable man. Being polar opposites of each other, Wilhelm and Bismarck had an ever-growing number of disagreements, most notably over workers' rights, which eventually led to Wilhelm insisting on Bismarck's resignation, which he duly gave on the 18th of March 1890. Wilhelm then effectively took control over Germany after Bismarck's departure and resolved to continue with its militaristic expansion, both of its armed forces and colonies around the world, but perhaps most importantly of its high seas fleet, which would come in time to rival Britain's massive home fleet in the early 1900s and lead, at least in part, to Britain, France and Russia forming alliances against Germany in the build-up to the First World War. Kaiser Wilhelm, in ascending to the German throne, had essentially been gifted the most powerful and modern state in Europe, if not the world, when he became emperor, and over the next few decades did nothing but to jeopardise its future by continually seeking to antagonise his powerful neighbours as a result of his massive stupidity and overinflated ego. Bismarck himself warned Wilhelm regularly about his decisions, and also commented on the growing instability in Europe at the time, at one point warning, and I quote, "One day, the great European war will come out of some damned foolish thing in the Balkans." The old man spent his final years writing his memoirs, which shed light on his decisions that he had made during his career, but his health steadily deserted him until his death at around midnight on the 30th of July 1898 at the age of 83. Bismarck's body was then laid to rest in the Bismarck Mausoleum in Friedrichsruhe, northern Germany, and his tomb was inscribed with the epitaph, "A loyal German, servant of Emperor Wilhelm I." There is no doubt that Otto von Bismarck's actions in life in many ways shaped the next 100 years of European history, and in unifying Germany under Prussian control, he in effect brought into being a country whose outlook and ethos was one of organisation and prowess in warfare. Although it is perhaps true that no other German state than Prussia had the power and ability to unify Germany, Prussia's military traditions would in the early 20th century mean that Germany had the most highly organised armies on earth, along with the most highly modernised and efficient industrial base in Europe at least. This combination of Prussia's proud, aggressive military outlook and Germany's highly modernised economy would, along with its continued association with Austria, bring about and perpetuate the most destructive war in human history up until that time. A war which in many ways was played out in two parts, from 1914 to 1918 with the First World War, and with the Second World War from 1939 to 1945. In both cases, the same Prussian militaristic aggression and German industrial brilliance would plunge Europe into slaughter, and it was only with the total occupation and destruction of Germany after World War II did this militaristic Prussian outlook finally die. Otto von Bismarck could not have foreseen the sheer scale and events in which his actions in life would bring about. He was one of the greatest and most capable statesmen in European history, being manipulative, highly intelligent and ruthless in his goals. In essence, Bismarck was the perfect politician. He was seldom out of control of events and achieved his aims in life more than the vast majority of leaders in European and world history. I cannot say that Bismarck was a good man or moral man, but I can say that he was a brilliant man whose life and decisions directly shaped both European and world events for nearly 100 years after his death. Sadly, the importance and effect of Otto von Bismarck on our lives today and the lives of our recent ancestors is largely ignored, but I have no doubt that he was one of the most important figures in modern European and world history, and his achievements in life deserve greater understanding, recognition and respect than they currently enjoy in the modern day.